have always loved hiking. There is something magical about escaping the noisy city, forgetting about endless messages, traffic jams, and never-ending conversations. In the forest, everything is different. There, it is just you, nature, and the feeling of something old, primal, something we almost never notice in everyday life. I often went on hikes, usually with friends or in a group. But this time, I wanted to be alone. I felt the need to take a break from people, from their voices, their problems, from the constant noise that seems natural until you leave it behind. I spent a long time choosing my route. I wanted something not too popular among tourists, but not too dangerous either. Eventually, I settled on a tried-and-true option, a mountain trail that passed through a dense forest and led to a pass that had long been abandoned. Of course, I was not careless. I took everything necessary: a map, a compass, a tent, a supply of water, a purification filter, a knife, a flashlight with extra batteries, and a first aid kit. I knew that even in the safest hike, unexpected situations could arise. The first day of the journey was perfect. I woke up early, reached the starting point, checked my gear, reviewed the route one more time, and headed into the forest. The sun shone brightly. The air was fresh, carrying the pleasant scent of pine. The dirt path was dry, my feet didn't sink in, and walking was easy. I moved forward slowly, photographing everything around me: twisted tree roots, unusual mushrooms, lizards basking on rocks. By evening, I reached a river. There was a perfect clearing for camping, flat, without stones, near the water. I set up my tent, lit a small fire, and brewed myself some tea. I sat by the fire, warming my hands and listening to the sounds of the night. An owl hooted somewhere in the darkness. Small animals rustled in the bushes. Somewhere in the water, a fish splashed. Everything was as it should be. I fell asleep quickly, waking up only once in the middle of the night when I heard a strange sound. It was as if someone was lightly running their fingers over the fabric of my tent. But when I opened my eyes and listened, everything was silent. I told myself it was just the wind. On the second day, I continued my journey. The trail became less distinct. The trees grew denser, and sunlight barely broke through the canopy. It felt like the forest was enclosing me, hiding me from the rest of the world. Around noon, I heard the first strange noises. At first, they sounded like normal nature sounds, the wind in the treetops, branches cracking somewhere deep in the forest. But the more I listened, the more it seemed like this was not just random noise. It seemed like someone was following me. The footsteps were barely audible, almost imperceptible. They would appear and disappear. I stopped several times, staring into the dark thickets behind me, but saw nothing. I told myself it was just my imagination. By evening, I set up my tent among the trees and lit a fire again. I tried to calm myself down, tried to convince myself that nothing strange had happened. But at night, I woke up again to footsteps. This time, they were closer. Someone was slowly walking around my tent. I lay still. I felt a chill run down my spine. I tried to breathe quietly, listening intently. The footsteps stopped. Silence fell. I waited. 10, maybe 15 minutes passed. I couldn't stand it and carefully peeked outside. No one. Only the dark forest and the faint moonlight filtering through the branches. I went back into the tent, but couldn't fall asleep again. In the morning, I stepped outside and froze. On the ground, near my tent, were footprints. I knelt down and examined them closely. They looked human, but the toes were too long, almost stretched out. I told myself it was my imagination. I told myself that maybe they were just distorted shoe prints. I packed up my things and moved on. I didn't want to stay in this place another night. At noon, I saw it. Among the trees stood an old stone arch. It looked like it had once been part of some ancient passage. It was almost entirely covered in moss, cracked, overgrown with grass. It looked old, very old. It wasn't marked on my map. I stepped closer. The wind suddenly died down. The forest went still. Even the air around me seemed thicker. And then I heard the sound. It wasn't just a sound. It was a whisper, distant, as if coming from beneath the ground. The words were impossible to make out, but I felt that they were meant for me. Fear gripped me. I stepped back. The whisper grew louder. I took another step back, And then I saw it. In the shadow of the arch, something moved, like a shadow that didn't belong to any object. I turned and ran. I didn't look back. I ran until I reached a familiar part of the trail. When I stopped and looked around, the arch was gone. I never went hiking alone again. I never thought that a simple trip into the forest could change my perception of the world around me. We were a young group, planning to visit one of the forests located on the outskirts of the city. It was a forest that almost no one had heard of, secluded, abandoned, far from any civilization. A forest that had no traces of human presence, wasn't on any tourist map, and wasn't marked in any guidebook. This isolation was what attracted us. We had no expectations, just a desire to spend a day outdoors, escape the noise of the city, fish, relax, and enjoy nature. What could go wrong? It seemed like the perfect getaway. We left early in the morning, a light hike through the dense forest, and everything seemed fine at first. The first few hours were just like any typical day in the woods. Trees, grass, birds, insects. Everything looked as a forest should. We walked for several kilometers, not stopping much because it was fun. But after a few hours, the forest began to change. At first, we didn't pay much attention to it. Everything seemed natural. But the deeper we went, the stranger things started to feel. There was an odd silence. At first, there were no birds singing, no sounds of insects. The forest felt unnaturally quiet, and this silence started to create an uncomfortable feeling. It was as if the air became heavier, making it hard to breathe deeply. It was difficult to explain, but it felt like something was wrong. Maybe it was the stillness, or maybe it was because we were now venturing off the path, where the trees grew thicker and the ground became more uneven. But as we continued, we started to feel that something or someone was watching us. Eventually, we decided to take a break on a small clearing. The forest around us was still, almost oppressive in its silence. It felt like something had changed in the air, and I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I sat on an old stump, trying to gather my thoughts, but that's when I noticed something strange between the trees. It wasn't a visible figure, but rather a shadow, an indistinct movement that caught my eye. I couldn't tell whether it was just a trick of the light or something more, but it didn't feel right. It was as if whatever it was observing us, standing perfectly still between the trees. I tried to dismiss it, assuming it was just my imagination. But then, something even stranger happened. The clearing, which had seemed so peaceful moments ago, fell off. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that the forest was closing in around us. Even though I couldn't clearly see anything, I felt like something or someone was watching us from the shadows. This eerie sensation was unlike anything I had ever experienced before. As we prepared to leave, I noticed something even more unsettling. Our gear had disappeared. No, it wasn't just that our things were misplaced. They had been moved, and not just a little. Our bags, equipment, everything had been moved several meters away from where we left them, scattered on the ground in disarray. We hadn't heard anything. There were no footsteps, no signs that anyone had been around. It felt as though something invisible had taken them and placed them there on purpose, like we were being toyed with. That was enough. We decided to leave the clearing and head back. But the more we walked, the more we felt like we were being followed. The forest was eerily quiet, but I could sense something just behind us. It wasn't a noise or a movement. It was a presence, something intangible but real. We couldn't see anything, yet the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. The air grew thick again, and it became harder to breathe. Finally, after what felt like hours, we reached the edge of the forest. We stepped onto an open field, bathed in sunlight, and I thought we were safe. But as I looked back, I felt a chill run down my spine. It wasn't just that the forest was behind us. It was as if the forest had taken something from us, something we couldn't explain. It felt like we were leaving only a part of ourselves behind. And I couldn't shake the feeling that we had not been the only ones in that forest. None of us spoke much on the way back, and even now, years later, I can't forget the sense of unease. I don't know what it was we encountered in that forest, but I know one thing for sure. Sometimes the forest holds more than just nature. Sometimes it holds something darker, something ancient and watching. And I have no intention of returning there to find out what else it might hide. A few weeks ago, a few friends and I ventured into a forest we had never been to before. It was one of those forests that never made it onto tourist routes, remote, unexplored, and not even marked on the map. We knew it was truly isolated, and that was exactly what attracted us. Away from the city's hustle, with the noise of cars and people, just us and nature. We thought it would be the perfect getaway. Time for conversations, roasting meat over a fire, and falling asleep under the stars. But what happened changed my view of forests forever. The first 2 days went smoothly. We set up camp by a stream. Its water was cold and clear, and the air was so fresh it was hard to believe a place like this still existed on Earth. The weather was perfect, the sun softly illuminating everything around us. And at night we enjoyed the silence, which was so deep that even our conversations felt like an intrusion on this unbroken harmony. Everything was calm. Nothing hinted at trouble. But the third day changed everything. In the morning, we went for a walk deeper into the forest, looking for interesting spots to enjoy the beauty of nature even more. After a few kilometers, we came across an old path, covered in moss and overgrown with weeds, as if it hadn't been used for years. This forest was strange. It felt like it was timeless, an inseparable part of time that never changes. It was so quiet that even the rustling of the leaves seemed louder than usual. We decided to walk along this path, and after a few minutes, we came to a small clearing where old trees grew, resembling giant guardians of the place. We all immediately felt that there was something unsettling about it, although nothing specific could be pointed out. It was an indescribable feeling, just a heavy peace that hung over us. But we laughed it off and decided to rest, sitting on the grass and watching the sun filtering through the branches of the trees. Everything changed when we heard a noise. At first, it was just a faint crack like a twig snapping in the distance. We didn't think much of it, assuming it was a normal forest sound. But the noise continued, growing louder and closer. I looked around and immediately felt a chill. There was nothing to be seen. We all heard it now, and with each passing second, the noise grew clearer. None of us said a word, but we all felt that something wasn't right. I decided to check it out. Getting up from my spot, I cautiously started moving toward the source of the noise, which seemed to be getting closer with each step. With every step I took, the crackling grew louder, but there was still nothing in sight. It wasn't the sound of animals or birds. It was something more, something unnatural. I looked back and all my friends were standing still listening. In their eyes, I saw the same thing. Fear, but they didn't move, afraid to make even the slightest noise. When I got closer to the source of the sound, I noticed that the air around me was becoming thicker. It was like I was stepping into an invisible but dense mass. The shadows of the trees seemed longer, and the sunlight appeared dimmed. And then, right in the center of the clearing, I saw it. It was a figure standing before me, but it was unclear, like a shadow cast upon the ground. Tall, without any facial features, without any discernible movement. It just stood there, as if it was part of the forest itself. I froze. It felt like time had stopped, and everything around us had paused. I could feel the cold seeping into my very heart. This wasn't just a shadow. It was something more, something from another world. The shadows started to move, and I, unable to bear it any longer, stepped back. When I returned to camp, my friends had already started noticing that something was wrong. Our backpacks were no longer where we left them. This made us even more uneasy. We decided it was time to pack up and leave before things got worse. But I couldn't shake the image of that figure standing in the clearing, which still lingered in my mind. That evening, as we made our way out of the forest, I realized that we weren't alone. I heard footsteps behind us, but whenever I turned around, there was nothing. This wasn't just a shadow or an animal. It was something alive, something that was part of this forest. When we left the forest, I never returned. I don't even want to think about what might have happened if we had stayed longer. And although my friends didn't experience it the way I did, I know for sure now. Sometimes there are places where it's better not to stay for too long.